Hey, hello there. I'm Chris from Airwindows, and here I am on a Monday morning at 11 o'clock explaining what's going on with my mysterious absence of plugin. There's a reason. Let me fool with my windows for a second, don't mind me. Fiddling with my stuff just a bit. There we go. So hey, I have been a busy fellow, but not in exactly the same ways that I have before. And hi Bo, how's it going? I'm working on something new, and it's taken more work than usual. So, how about I tell you what happened? How about I tell Bo what happened? Bo and whoever else just showed up what happened. Because here's the thing, is this is not bad news. This is just something unusual going on. So I am working on a kit based off of like my little notes here, having to do with a introduction to Airwindows plugins and mixing rig. The idea is to put together a set of plugins that people can have, and as always it's freely downloadable, but rather than downloading a enormous terrifying package of 200 different plugins and then needing to guess how to use them. Don't mind me, I'm going to fiddle with my stuff a little bit more so that I can see my VU meter. The idea is to make a smaller package and say, hey, if you're going to get into using plugins and if you're going to get into mixing, download this, install these. It'll be arranged much like new updates.zip, but there will be a much smaller set of plugins, and I've been working out what those are. In fact, I think I might even still have them open in Finder. Yeah, I kind of do. Yeah, so I can switch to this, and I can read you off what I've got so far. But the deal is, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's not included. There's going to be a lot of stuff that is like more expert mode, and it's weighted around stuff that is either featureless or very approachable. The kind of stuff where a newbie isn't going to like blow off their own foot trying to use it. And this is why I didn't have a plugin posted on Sunday. I was recording a full-on, up to the moment, rock heavy metal track and doing a full analog mix on it, which I will then try to beat with the introduction to Airwindows mixing kit. So that's why no post on Sunday. I was busy and I was also tired and had blisters on my fingers, or I might as well have had blisters on my fingers considering the way I was wailing on the drums. So what you're going to hear when this posts is I'll have a and I really got to get a better location for this little teeny microphone. Don't mind me. ULA and DC offset will not be included in the beginner buttons. No. Those are bad choices for the beginner ones. So once people pile in and start being ready to hear about that, I see I got 7 folks showing up to hear what I'm doing. I'll tell you a little bit about the the track that I made and how I made it for the start, because that proved interesting. And one of the interesting things about it, there's a number of interesting things about it. One of them is I've returned to Logic. Yeah. The beginner kit is the reason I alluded to as to why I didn't want to add a master output on tape, but tape is not being included. I have sort of purer notions for it, and the analog mix I did of this track didn't actually go to tape. So if I did have tape to mix it down to, then maybe I would be thinking in terms of doing that. But no, I'm putting together a basic kit that has, I think, well, not quite, but next to no fake analog stuff. I think that's too complicated to get into, and it's fairly easy to tack on externally. You know, if you go to the Airwindows website, you can download individual plugins as well as the entire new updates.zip pile. So people who are like, this is awesome, but I must have tape, have a couple of choices to go with. They might, for instance, like iron oxide, but I didn't want to include that. So this track that I did, and today I can't play it for you over the stream. It's going to be a bigger splash than that when it comes out, but I was using the synth to sort of help compose it. So it's partially composed by Modular Synth Madness and Music Thing Modular kits. So what I did was I had the chord organ stuff set up the same way as the ambient one last time. And I did a fun thing with the ambient one last time where I had the chord organ stuff following notes and playing like bass notes. And then I ran a square wave from that into the reset for the radio music doing my voice talking. So I basically did a wave table thing using me talking to the live chat in that way that I've been doing recently, but rather than just scraping around the pitches of it to make it be weird and robotic sounding, I had it tuned. And I went from that to setting up chord sequences, in this case using, what the living hell is that stuff? Mimetic Digitalis, which is a sequencer that you can randomize stuff. So I just had it randomize a bunch of like 16-note patterns and then put the clock in only on the x-axis, meaning that I had 4 different 4-chord sequences that I could switch among, and I ran with that. And all this is how I got a basic track that was enough for me to start overdoing stuff onto and learning how the chords went. So I got chords generated using that and using my usual sort of techno music kind of thing. And then did bass guitar tracking on top of it. That bass, for the first time, finally got to use it. And I got to use it properly, meaning it's a Rickenbacker. That particular one didn't come with Rico sound, but I wired it in by removing the switch and wiring it directly to the output jack. It's actually like a 4000 or something, not really a 4001, so it's not supposed to have the bass pickup in the first place. So if you plug a regular cord in, you get the bridge pickup. And if you plug a stereo cord in, I plugged the bridge pickup into my guitar amp and the bass pickup into a DI, and ended up flipping the phase on that, although there are numerous things you can do with a situation like that. So, yeah, my throat is all grumbly. It's going to be a lot worse by the time I finished with today, because I have a lot of talking to people over the internet. I got 1 hour and 37 minutes. Yes, it's down a little bit from 40 minutes, because money, it directly reflects what the Patreon's doing. It went whoop, And that's what I've been asking for, so people are taking care of themselves as needed, and this is all good. But the bass tone that I always wanted and could never have was that Rickenbacker double setup where your bridge pickup should be running into a guitar amp so it can distort a little bit. And that gives you that prog rock tone. And I nailed it. I basically got the prog rock tone exactly the way it should be. And that's very pleasing to me. Now, after that, I ran guitars, and I got my heavy guitar sounds by going the orange color driver pedal into only the last part of a Devi Ever Helios. So it's two different gain stages, and one of them is sort of the very transistory bright one and has some tone controls on it, and the other one is a more vintage style fatness overdrive boost, and the combination of those two gave me a heavy guitar sound with the right behavior. But before doing the guitars, I went up and played drums and have a oh, Joko is having problems. Yeah, that might be like, that's just your opinion, man. I don't want to hit it very quietly with the mic. Instead, all of those are very, very loud snare hits. So you should try the original ones or somebody else's samples. Nobody says you're going to like my samples. They're supposed to sound like that. That is the sound of a, well, actually, to be fair, some of it is compression, and some of it is the fact that the metal of the snare tends to ring. So, you know, you say quite unusable as such, I say tomato. You know, go figure. Use somebody else's samples if you don't like mine. Mine are not the same as everybody else's sample, and I would never want to hit it very quietly. That's not how drums are supposed to sound as far as I'm concerned. Which you will hear with my drum recordings for the new song. That's going to be a colorful factor. Let me see now. Adding noise and improving hide stuff track to the depth of black you can use in film. Kind of could be. That's definitely something that could happen. It's also a hide problems thing. I think that's why some people do that. So my drumming on this new track, it's using the prog rock style kit, which is a Gretsch kit with a bunch of rototoms and a floor tom, and it's all drywall screwed to a plywood platform. And my miking is extremely unusual, but I think it worked, where I have sort of hip level microphones kind of to the sides and a little bit in front of the snare pointing inwards. And then I have a gobo, which is several doors bolted together that are also in the same basic shape. Like there's one right in front of the kick drum, and then there's another couple that are folded back a little bit, which is where the mics can fit in. And this causes a close-up accentuation. It breaks up the room resonances, but it also causes some very close echoes, like the immediate vicinity of the drums has much more complicated room geometry, and it's like closer than being packed in a closet, but it doesn't go all the way up to the ceiling. So what you get is some early reflections to densify things up as far as the immediate surroundings of the drums, but then very little in terms of like room resonance, which it's a small room, so you wouldn't want that anyhow. Yeah, well, Joko, I gotta tell you, it was one drum. And it's different hits off of essentially the same thing. That's kinda how that works. That was my angle on that particular sound of that particular drum. The recordings I was doing yesterday were actually a different drum. I ended up getting another drum. I didn't have another drum when I was doing those samples, and when I was adjusting them to work with my techno stuff, if I want to put a drum in on that, I got to the purpose of that, and it needs to have a metallic twang because techno synth module drums tend to be just like bursts of white noise and stuff, or like they wind up with this 808, 901 style drum, and it needed like to be literally the opposite of that. So the metallic twang of the analog snare is absolutely what I needed. And it's very much what I got the other day doing the recording, because it's a steel snare that I use, although a bunch of things, this steel snare, I was hitting it so hard the lugs broke. So at some point I need to get new drum lugs. It's on my list of stuff that I gotta buy when it's possible for me to do that. Is I was hitting this drum so hard the lugs broke, and I'll need to replace them. So that's a bit of a drag, but it kind of shows you where I'm at as far as being a drummer is concerned. And I was doing a lot of just sort of loose human feel kind of stuff. Hey, hello there. I did 2 takes and then didn't micro edit them. Instead, I had a couple of things from the one take, a couple of things from the other. Oh, well, thank you for caring, Dusan. As you know, not everybody likes everything. And so I like it when people connect with something, because it's like I'm doing stuff where somebody who has very different tastes from you is meant to hate it. And those are the risks you run. When you're doing something, you don't know if you're doing something specific and properly unless somebody hates it. If anything is general enough, they'll be like, yeah, it's okay. It's a loser thing. So you got to do stuff enough that somebody will straight up hate it, which is why I'm pleased that Joko didn't like the samples, because it's like, those samples are specific samples. They're doing a particular thing rather than covering all the bases. I never want to do that. So having done the drum recording, and I'm losing people with all this talk, but that's fine because it doesn't really matter. I'm talking about a thing that I can't actually show you yet, and a larger project that will become interesting to people. I did the guitars, and the guitars was based on, first of all, the distortions and things that I told you about, but also the Metallica trick of you got your left guitar, you got your right guitar, and then the thickener in the middle. And that was the track that I used for solos and things as well. I did some extremely sick guitar solos on this track. I guess it's the fact that I was returning to hard rock / metal for the first time in a really long time, and had like good bass and decent drums. Like the drums are a little garagey, but the sound of them is far from garagey. It's just I'm not a trained and practiced drummer, so I basically got up and wailed the hell out of the drums for a while, and that's what you get. So I'm not going to be replacing Steve Gadd anytime soon, but Steve Gadd doesn't hit drums as hard as I do as a rule. So there was the left and the right and the thickener, and the left and the right were more heavily saturated and made to be this sort of wall of heaviness and distortion. And in the middle one, I took that out. I took out specifically I took out the Devi Ever pedal, the extra saturation, and stuck with the color sound, which is like the early transistor overdrive, like it's a Jeff Beck pedal. There are a number of people who have used that kind of stuff. The color tone, I think it's been called also. It's the guitar distortion pedal that has boost and then also treble and bass control. And is vintage and costs the frickin' earth, but maybe you can homebrew one. There are ways to do these things. And I set that up so that it had less gain, and then ended up playing the middle part also with my fingernails rather than the left and right ones. I was using a pick because I was concerned that just using my fingernail, it's too blunt. You don't get the same heavy guitar sound. You get a sort of smushy, scrubby sound. And that's fine, but I was looking for something that was going to stand up and be much huger. And in so doing, it's two different style. Like there's pick, which I'm not all that familiar with, honestly. And the middle one was just my fingernail doing those. And I ended up doing a sort of hit effect on them rather than a scrub effect like with the pick, which meant that it was a little bit more impactful in some ways, but also since it was fingernails rather than pick, it was much less impactful. So the sharpness of the attack was tighter but also softer at the same time. So basically a bunch of guitar work, and mixed it on the analog desk. I had a bunch of weird stuff going on with it, like hi-hat sounds and things, and did a full-on analog mix with like the analog desk and the analog compressor and all that kind of stuff, and didn't do anything other than a lot of editing and a lot of editing out tracks and things. Some entire tracks went away and turned out not to be useful. And then a lot of other stuff got, use the samples in unres or whatever the hell we call that, ULAW. So here's the thing. My next job is to duplicate this analog mix that I did in the box using a limited number of Airwindows plugins that I'm going to put forth as these are the ones you should use if you're learning how to mix, because there's a number of interesting things going on. Like right now, people generally have time to kill. I don't. I'm working much harder because I don't have enough time to do all of the stuff that I need to do. So I'm definitely getting kind of tired and drinking lots of coffee. But a lot of people are going through hardship, and I wish them best, but they also have more time to kill than usual, and they're going kind of stir crazy. So this is a fine time to jump into learning how to mix and learning how to do stuff. And I think that is a very appropriate thing to do, and a very appropriate thing for me to do. And I'm not alone in that. I'm given to understand that Apple is doing like 90-day free trials of Final Cut Pro and Logic X. Just as I returned to Logic, because doing this guitar rock tracking type stuff, I'm just familiar with it. I was using it since Logic 7, so changing over to Reaper is cool, and I have all the respect in the world for that. But I am a lot more comfortable with using Logic for elaborate things. And this counts as an elaborate thing, although it's not. It's like less than 16 tracks. Big sessions use much more than that. I've been watching some of this stuff. In fact, one of my Airwindows folks joined me on the Minecraft and was very interested in something that the Spitfire Audio guy is doing called a piano book. He was really into that. I was like, wow, I've heard about that. I've been watching his videos. Fair amount I've been watching just that guy's videos and not the Spitfire Audio videos, which is kind of funny, but it's like I look at those and they're straight up just relatively mediocre giant advertisements for their samples, as they should be. That is their company YouTube thing, so they're exactly what they should be. But I'm liking like the main guy and his weirder and more personal and strangely like needier, and he likes doing this vlogging stuff and has darn good production values going on, and that's also interesting to me, learning how to do that bit by bit. So I need to do these plugins in such a way that I can take this entirely analog mix, replicate it in the box, and my goal is to clone it, to come up with exactly the things that I'm going to need in order to be able to do the same thing as the mixer. And the mixer is a complicated sort of multi-stage mixer. It has different topologies, and some of its topologies are negative feedback topology, and some of the topology is positive feedback topology. But the end result is that it sounds marvelous, and it also uses transformers extensively on the inputs and outputs, and so does the compressor. So when I'm doing a full mix through that analog system, one of the things it's getting is a lot in the way of compressors, and so a lot in the way of transformers. And so obviously I would have to use coil. No, I'm not actually using coils. Let me tell you the list of, and actually maybe I'll get like really wacky and open another window. Can I duplicate that? Apparently not. I can, however, copy it. And paste it. So here we have, I'll hide it under the other one. I'd hide my face. Let me see now. Boop. So here's my list as it currently stands. Yeah, that's a good idea, Jokosakovan. Handled properly, it's a good idea. Hey, Drummond. So here's my list so far. This is what I have in mind for doing the Airwindows mixing system, the basic one. Oh, how convenient. I can shrink it right down. I'll do that. Neat. I can sit up here. So here's the thing. I think the correct EQ for this collection is Baxandall, for the reason that it is a really broadband EQ and has a very gentle slope, and it's very approachable. It's a really broad strokes adjuster. Like, you can use it to take out some bassiness, but you don't get really fussed about the crossover points or anything. You don't have the luxury of doing really sophisticated things with it, although granted, the built-in DAW EQ is always available. All you do is put that on your channel after Purist Console channel, and your DAW EQ will be expanded outward somewhat, especially if you're doing high Q things. So there's two filters right up top, Baxandall and capacitor. They do different things. Baxandall is the broad stroke, gentle curves kind of thing, where you can sort of lift the general level of treble or bass or tone them down or whatever. It's very approachable. Capacitor is also approachable, but in a different way. It's the one that sounds maybe a little synthetic. It's got a very clear cutoff, and you sort of trap in mid-range stuff that way. So you can use it to wipe low frequency stuff and tighten up lows, or you can use it to roll off highs, at which point it will very clearly and strikingly roll that stuff off. Directly below that I have clip only. Clip only is only the soft clipping part, or the treble softening part, out of 80 clip 4, if I'm not mistaken. And the thing that's special about clip-only, which I did not necessarily remember at the time, but I went back and looked at what I've been doing, and I'm like, oh, I did this, yeah. That one is doing a thing where got my maid just playing with stuff. Clip-only has a magic number built into it. I ended up calculating out when the clip-only thing engages, which in early 80 clips is a fixed number, and in later 80 clips it's an adjustable parameter. But when I ran it through white noise and sort of torture tested it, I found there was a sweet spot at which it behaved best when hit with extremely high amplitude audio. And as I narrowed down this sweet spot, I found that sweet spot was essentially pretty close to cosine x, or cosine 1. And for that reason, I made clip-only that particular parameter. So clip-only is optimized. Rather than having the adjustable softening thing and a control for you and stuff, it's like, hey, I zeroed down the magic number for when this is perfect. And that's what it is. You're welcome. So clip-only is a featureless plugin. It has no controls. I've got as many of those as I can in here. dBESS is the most recent de-esser. And that is there because I think that's a useful enough thing to have in a starter mixing kit for if you've got vocals and maybe you've got like a garbage condenser mic or something. Some incredibly cheap condenser mic that you're doing vocals into, and it just happens to fry the S's incredibly harshly. Now, I have not yet made a super approachable or preset de-esser, but dBESS is as close as I'm gonna get. So that is the optimized one. It'll require a little bit of teaching people how to do. Focus, of course, is my mid-range booster. Mid-range booster is designed to focus in on where our ears are most sensitive and give a little lift of whatever cue, whatever resonance works for you. That is like a distortion boost inside that. So focus is there so that if you have sounds and they're just not standing out in something like a guitar or a voice need to come through the mix, rather than trying to do it with EQs, that is a very approachable way of doing that. I got Interstage in there. Interstage is another featureless plugin. That's what I'm choosing to use instead of Coils. Because I checked out Coils and what it was doing, and I checked out Interstage and what it was doing. And Interstage is doing a bass tightening and treble moderating thing that I think is in some ways superior to what Coils has. It's an alternate way of doing it. I just think Interstage worked out pretty well. That is for the purpose of finding a way to stick stuff into the DAW mix so that you can pretend that you've got transformers all over everything. That's the idea. It's got to be stuff besides just Purist Console, because Purist Console is so clean. It needs to have some stuff that are coloring agents, but not so much like mimicking particular brands of stuff. Like I'm doing Heritage stuff, and that tends to be more Navy. As it happens, Interstage has something of a Navy quality to it because it has a basefulness thing that it brings in. But I have specifically avoided things that are name brand. And other than perhaps Baxandall, but that's a general category of things. And of course, capacitor is a kind of object. After Interstage, we got monitoring. Monitoring is, yes, I am. I am not using this guy, I'm using Interstage. Monitoring is the learn how sound works thing, and it also gives you automatic dithering at several different levels and a whole range of useful kinds of outputs, including like audio outputs and the mixed reaction stuff that I was getting with the headphones, you know, the cans settings. It's got all that stuff going on. So that is the culmination, and that's the final thing to go on your chain. After that, you see pressure 4 and pressure 4 mono. In VST, that's only pressure 4. Audio units run end-to-end, so you can make specifically stereo ones, and the reason that the Mac stuff is including a separate pressure 4 is because the stereo version of pressure 4 is using a special stereo linking thing, and that will get better results on like the 2-bus. I have every expectation of using pressure 4 on the 2-bus to try to mimic what Successor was doing. That was the compressor that I went to, because pressure has been one of my most successful ones as far as just top tonal performance and flexibility. It's kind of the max that I've really gotten in some ways. The experiments that I've done in other directions have either brought extra controls, like Logical has SSL style emulation and is trying to do particular things with the tone, and it's also trying to do things like give you ratio controls. Pressure doesn't have any of that. It's much simpler, although the controls it does have are a little weird, and they're going to take some explaining. And again, on Mac, pressure 4 mono is the end-to-end version. That's what you put on individual tracks, and that is what you would put on like a quadraphonic or 5.1 track if you wanted to compress that, because end-to-end runs on all different kinds of things. Then you got Purist Console Bus and Purist Console Channel selected because they are the simplest and safest versions. Like I could be doing Console 5 or whatever, but yeah, Interstage has slew stuff going on, absolutely. One of the reasons I'm choosing it. I could choose Console 5, I could choose a number of sophisticated things, but there's the danger of somebody starting to learn to mix and they're using SoftSynths and they're like, I have this very nice sawtooth wave, which is exactly the thing that used to cause Console 5 problems. And as much as I did stuff to work around that, I'm looking at going with Purist Console because it is immune to those problems. It does not have any slew-related compress, decompress. So you don't have to do anything particularly fancy with it. And lastly, Purist Gain. And I'm leaving out bit shift gain because Purist Gain ought to perform as well, and it has the two different options. One of them is -40 to +40 dB. And the other one is the continuous slider, and the continuous slider is gain smoothed. And they're both operational at the same time. They make the same overall number, but the 0 to 1 slider will go to complete silence, and it is also smoothed much more aggressively than the other one, so it cannot abruptly do sudden fader moves. It cannot do abrupt gain moves, but it can give you this lovely fluid sound. And if you're doing subtle things with gain moves, it's not a bad option. It's not a bad option for if you're riding a fader, ride that one, and then have more specific trims put in on the Purist Gain upper fader that has the dB markings on it. And that one doesn't go to 0, that one goes to -40 dB. But that one will give you more specific gain controls. So yeah, let me have a quick glance at some of my Q&As while I'm at it, because I've successfully described what's going on here. And Joko has a good point about the averaging filter, because the thing about it is, if you're doing binaural hearing, which is a much more complicated subject than I can get into with the base kit, stuff on the far side of your ear is not getting direct sound waves into it. So you're only getting sound waves that are able to wrap around your head, and high frequency sound waves are obstructed by objects. So doing a averaging filter, and it's also relevant to slightly delay the far side thing, but that just becomes a very complicated scenario. I have not yet done my experiments with the complicated scenario. When I do that one, it's going to be one of those heinously complicated plugins with all of these different sliders and things. And I will expect that like 2 or 3 people will be like, oh my god, it's the best thing ever, and then nobody else will care, and that's fine. Sometimes I do stuff for just a few people. And yeah, you wouldn't necessarily even want to do automatically 2 filters. What you're going to want to do is go between just the one sample, and then start bringing in the combination of samples, like go between 1 and 0 to 75%, 25%, or indeed 50-50, which is the full-on averaging. And if you start bringing in other samples, you start getting weird comb filtery things. Although that might have its own advantages, but it's sample rate dependent. I tried to pick stuff that was essentially not so sample rate dependent. And you'd be interested to note that I don't consider pan a fundamental building block. I'm an LCR guy. I think stuff should be left, center, and right as a whole. And that's how I was mixing my mixes and how I generally do stuff. But there are exceptions, and there are always extra things that you can do. Now, A asks how to make the plugins easier to use in Cakewalk. There are solutions to this. They are not solutions that I personally produce. What you're going to need to do is get some kind of hosting plugin, like you were trying to host the VSTs in Pro Tools or something. You could go to Blue Cat, for instance, and when you do that, and I could do that with VSTs and things in Logic. For instance, if I end up doing VSTs with controls and stuff, I could go out and get a copy of Patchwork or something like that and host the stuff that I intend to host in Logic, in Patchwork, which is its own plugin hosting environment. And when a plugin hosting environment does that, if the person who's doing it is good, they can do a better job than the DAW can. So what you wind up doing is, if you're doing a DAW, which I suppose is Sonar, and it's capable of doing, I think you're going to be using VSTs, and the VSTs typically come with GUIs, and that can pose problems of its own, but it means that doing that plugin, which is being made in a GUI, if it hosts other plugins, it can host them better than what you would start with. So you could have, like, specifically, I know for a fact that Blue Cat and Patchwork and Late Replies, the delay, for instance, they host generic plugins by adding like little knobs and things, although it loses some of the things that you get with Apple's interpretation of generic plugins. Apple lets you punch in, like, type in values and stuff. There's a hold option for more subtle variations and things like that. So Apple lets you do extra stuff. Blue Cat won't necessarily do that, but they'll give you a pretty GUI and a fake knob. So, pick your poison. But it will definitely be larger in Cakewalk if you do that. So you find somebody who's able to make hosting programs and go bug them and say, make this the GUI that I need in exactly the size that I want, and so on, and maybe they will. And that would count as a plugin wrapper in a sense. Deucin asks, is there an idea to port support amps. I hadn't actually been looking at amps, but it's not impossible. That's something that I believe I can get some of them out. I hesitate because I think they were kind of garbage. But if you like using them on drums, it's like, well, that's fair. You know, I can think they're kind of garbage because they're not really like amps, but they're alternative distortion devices. So who am I to judge? Who am I to say my plugins are garbage when somebody else is like, I don't know, it works perfectly for me. So there you go. So yeah, that can find its way eventually. You know, keep coming around and asking for it if you consistently keep wanting it. And, you know, basically, I might mouth off if I get bugged continually for something that I'm not doing yet because I've got something else happening. But it does give me a sense of what somebody is persistently wanting. Like, I'm doing an ambient music stream because somebody was persistently asking for it, and because it's something that I can do. I'm not sure if that's working for the person who asked it, because they might have been wanting something very different and really wanting me to just like do music, but exactly like this and this and such and so of a way. But regardless, it gave me a new thing to do, and that's always different every week, so we'll see. So yeah, come back and continue asking for stuff if I have not put it out yet, and you're like, oh, I want the thing. Eventually, there will come a time when I have worked my way through my backlog, and it will become a relevant thing. I'll always get around to stuff, so long as I live and I'm still doing this. German asks, do you know why channel 5 saturates and causes clipping in tracks that are recorded loud? Literally channel 5? That would be because it is a distortion plugin. I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, if you mean having it set to 0 and it's still saturating, it shouldn't be doing that. But if you have it in any of the slider settings, it will go from nothing to spiral, and from spiral to the full density algorithm. And it's supposed to distort, and that's why it would be distorting. And if you've got stuff recorded at -3 or it's peaking at -3 or -1, it's a soft curve. So technically, channel fully cranked will distort every single sound you put into it, no matter how soft. It's just that you don't notice it at the incredibly quiet stuff because the degree of distortion is so faint there, but it's still doing it. So it is saturating literally everything when cranked all the way up. When it's at halfway, which is spiral, it's still doing it, but it's even more subtle. So channel 5, when you turn on that boost zone, always clips. Always clips. It's using a soft clipping algorithm that is never not engaged. It's just a question of how obvious it is for you. Yeah, you know, Joku, I get the center right left thing, not from Amiga modules, but from some of the biggest engineering names in the business. Because some of those places that I hang out where it's like, oh, hey, it's William Whitman. He mixed Cyndi Lauper's She's So Unusual and a whole bunch of other stuff besides, and is a really heavyweight guy with his own odd opinions. And so, like, he is also a Rickenbacker bass fan, but thinks that they should always have flat wounds. And I'm like, I'm a Chris Squire fan. I like hearing Rickenbacker basses with round wounds, thank you, and distorting them, and having it be kind of like a heavy guitar or whatever, having it be much more prog rocky. And he's like, oh, no, you poor sweet summer child. No, you are so wrong. And I'm like, I guess we're just not going to agree. But when you go to these like heavyweight engineers, and I'm not talking like very trendy modern mixers, but people who have really, you know, they've got a lot of classic records under their belt. A lot of those folks came from situations where LCR was what you had and got results that in many ways are superior. To, like, put it this way, I do not think it is useful to do you can't do separation with panning. It just is not an acceptable answer. It is not an acceptable answer to go like, oh, here's my mix, and therefore, since I can't tell what's happening, and if everything was just all in mono, it was a big blur, so I'm going to pan stuff to separate it. And then you can hear that this thing is over here, this thing is over there. No, 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 no. Terrible, bad mistake. You don't want to do that. You want to have individual sounds that work in their own zones. And this is something that I think I'll be talking about for like the next half hour maybe, because I just don't need to talk about the mix kit that I'm showing you up on top here and what I propose to do with it. Namely, go into the box and replicate this analog mix that I did of a slightly augmented and accentuated heavy metal / hard rock track. And it's not every heavy metal hard rock track, but the reason I mixed it as I did and recorded it as I did was it's a good example of what I am trying to accomplish with audio. It is like, call it the anti-soothe. It's the one where, you know, my drum impacts and things, like the kick drum hits you in the chest violently, and it's quite loud, and it also links up with the bass, that attack of the Rickenbacker bass that you can get, and the attack of the guitars and stuff, to where the band can kick in with amazing violence, and it's all being done with transient energy. It's all being done with what people usually sort of flatten and eradicate, but it's balanced to where the attacks of everything merge together. And like, I'm using no EQ on the guitars because the EQ is being done with how I'm driving the guitars, like what pedals I'm using, what kind of pick or fingernail I'm using on the strings is controlling the pick attack. And the recording's being done through a small 12-inch speaker. Well, all 12-inch speakers are a specific size, maybe small. It's not the right word I want there. But it's a smaller cabinet rather than being a 4x12 Marshall stack. And mic'd using one of my Airwindows SM57s in such a way where it has the right kind of roll-off. It's not just all brightness. But that doesn't give you, that cab is not giving me extended bass. So in order to get extended bass on the heavy metal band sound, that has to be done through the DI of the bass guitar, and it has to be done through the low end of the drums, not necessarily just the kick, but the drums. That is not just the kick drum, like put a microphone on the kick drum and then equalize it to do what you want. No. I have the kick drum sitting on or bolted, drywall screwed to a large plywood rectangle plank sheet, a large plywood sheet on bricks. It's a riser, it's a drum riser. That means that when I wail on the kick drum, I am shaking the entire drum kit. I am vibrating all of the toms and things, and they're all ringing, and I have lots of them. I've got the floor tom, and then I got a bunch of rototoms, and the rototoms are filling in mid-range space rather than just a combination of sort of rumbles. Since rototoms don't have a wooden body to the tom, and since I'm miking them kind of edge on, they are giving, the resonance that they've got is going into the room, and the resonance that they've got is going through into the plywood plank. And so when I stomp on the kick, the entire room shakes, the plywood surface shakes, the toms and things shake, and actually the whole thing's wobble a little bit because I could stabilize that a little bit more. And as a result, there is no kick drum mic Actually, that I lie. There is. There is a left and a right, and the center mic is my kick drum mic. I have it behind my drum stool and about 1.5 feet off the ground and pointed at the kick drum. So I'm miking the batter side of the kick drum and flipping the face on the mic. And the whole point is to just have another strikingly different picture on the drums from minimal microphones. There's only 3. And it's reinforcing that kick drum. And you know, every single one of those is also a Airwindows style SM57. They're all like $99 mics that I've modified. And I put that up for people being able to see. That's a video that's actually done fairly well over time. So that's my SM57 drum kit miking. And the end result is, since nothing's close mic'd, everything is like 3 or more feet away. I'm getting kind of that classic rock, like I don't have nearly the time or the skill or the abilities of Ginger Baker, but it's got kind of that old Cream sound where the impact of the sound has this real thwack to it. It's a real aggressive, you never close mic a hi-hat. Hi-hat gets into everything, man. Unless you're Steely Dan. Steely Dan can mic hi-hats because they have people who can use them properly. And if you do mic a hi-hat, mic it with some kind of little crystal mic or something. Mic it with something that is insanely bright and just like, it will accentuate that. You know, mic it with a harp mic. I've done that. I've made samples out of it. So, my point being, oh, and here I should follow up the live chat before it scrolls off the screen. I love the fact that people are chatting, but I have to keep up. Amiga models, you know, panning. Well, the thing about panning is that's why you got L and R in the LCR idea. You're allowed to put stuff whang on one side or whang on the other. I did that with hi-hats in this upcoming track. The synthetic hi-hats that I had, I just strunked them all to the far left on the opposite side of where the real hi-hat lived. And I had a bright one and a dark hi-hat, and they don't play throughout the entire thing, and I have them down pretty quiet. But I have them on hard left. It's basically just, you know, it's only coming out of that one speaker, and that simplifies the mix while the element is still there. So yeah, hip hop, rock, Premiere, layer and drums and stuff a lot. How can I help you realize this? No, you can never pay me money to motivate me for this. Also, I'm not sure if you've explained what it is that you want. I better scroll back and find out. Idea to port amps to Linux to use on drums. That's what. Okay, well, again, if you want to help me realize that, come and keep bugging me about it, because I don't like those plugins, and so I haven't done them. I'm not the one that likes those plugins, so if I go for, like, next week I'm going to do this plugin that I really like, it's not going to be one of those. And I also feel it's rather confusing because I've promised some people to do better versions of amp style stuff, of which those are not. So I can do them, but you're going to have to keep bugging me about that, because I feel strongly like, oh, those are terrible, I didn't like what they did, I'm not happy with those, and there should be something else. And you're looking for literally what was already there. That's legit, but that's why you got to bug me about it. Is I'm not naturally going to go for it. I'm not naturally going to do that. Hypothetical situation. Oh, you've just reminded me of a thing which I'm going to see whether I can't. Interesting. Oh. Don't mind me derping around doing dumb things. I've just been reminded of something that I meant to do, and I forgot to do it. So let me try to do it better. Go into a plugin thing that I called Plugin Store. I had an idea that I had not followed out yet. See if you can guess what plugin I'm about to add. Any guesses? Yeah, but bug me about the plugins, especially if they're ones that I've done that I don't like and don't want to do, because otherwise I won't do them. And if people want them badly enough, that's possible to do, but you got to bug me about them, because otherwise I'll be like, I don't like that one and I don't want to do it. Guess which plugin I'm about to add to the Essentials list and why. That's not fair because it's too much of a delay on the streaming. Check this out. The reverb should be MV. And I'll tell you why. MV is based off of what I learned from MIDI verbs, and in particular it's the one where monitoring is already there, clip only is already there, got both of those covered. MV is the one where I'm doing all pass filters using only the bit shift gain style of exactly 0.5 or 2 multiplications. It's exactly a bit shift amplitude change. And that's the secret to the sound of the original MIDI verb, and I think the second MIDI verb too. The other secret is the fact that it's low sample rate, so it's darker. But MV does not have early reflections and is not a normal reverb algorithm. MV is a Bloom algorithm. So you can use it to get enormous, spacious, reverby things, or you can use it to get a shorter, tighter thing and you have a darker, brighter control that you can do with it. There's a number of variations you can do with it, but it will not do all that is a reverb thing. And the reason I'm choosing it for this purpose is because the concept is you should have a far-field ambience thing going on, but if you're just learning to do stuff with reverb, it shouldn't be obvious. Reverb, with a lot of context, with a lot of things that you might want to do, should not be overwhelmingly loud. Stuff isn't supposed to be drowning in reverb, unless you're in the 80s, in which case maybe you are. And that's why I would include only MV with the starter plugin kit, because somebody could go like, oh, I need a reverb, this is the one, MV. You include it, you build it into an AUX or something like that, you start feeding things with it, and then if you start turning it up really loud, it's going to sound bad. It's going to sound weird. You'll start noticing the strangenesses of it. The fact that it doesn't have immediate responses, the fact that it like fades away in a characteristic way. But if it's filling in just the sense of ambience, it's doing it in an effective way, a way that, you know, sounds deep, sounds distant, does this sort of stereo thing. If you're running it in stereo and feeding it with a stereo send, it will do dual mono style reverb, and that'll help stuff sound more spacious, but in a way where if you get aggressive or overly obvious with it in any context, the problems will immediately become apparent. And that will motivate people to not abuse reverb in the purpose of doing that kind of thing. And that is why I would choose MV as the sole reverb option in the Learn to Mix Airwindows Basic Starter Kit. That becomes one of the indispensable ones. So this is where I'm getting with some of these things as far as setting this up, setting it up to do mixes. And I needed to include that because I need to start doing the mix in certainly the next couple of days when I get energy up to do it again, because yesterday was a massive undertaking doing a full song with all the tracking and then also the mixing and stuff. And replicating that mix in the box is going to be another challenge, but I was going to be needing MV, so I'm glad that I thought of that. So yeah, now scroll up a little bit and catch some of these things. So in the hypothetical situation that you'd use a convolution reverb, I think I would use that as a sender return. And Logic as Space Designer, I'm sure there are other convolution reverbs that you can have. I even make convolution reverb samples available, though I'm not sure how obvious I've made that, so maybe I should make it more obvious that I've got those. Those are there too. But I would use it as a send return. That's what I would do. And if math calculations and algorithmic plugin, unless it was just the sole sound of something that I was doing, that's another option. If Acoustica sampling is it any different? It depends. Like if you run a high resolution enough calculations, I'll put it this way. Like, and this is not just Acoustica. Stephen Slate's stuff has done some interesting things regarding overprocessing and replacing the sound of whatever it is you're doing with something else. They have like microphone models and stuff that are all about that. And I think that they do lose a kind of analog-like immediacy, but they replace it with a whole color and personality that's like a behavior. So acoustic would be in the same basis. It's like past a point, you're no longer concerned with audio degradation because you're replacing the sound with something else. Now those of us, like what I've done with my analog mix for this particular challenge, this doing the starter set of plugins, telling people, hey, learn to mix doing this. This is an unusual set of things, and this will teach you what you need to know. The analog mix that I did for that specifically avoided using anything other than tracking into the DAW. I was using it like it was radar, which is I'm tracking directly into the DAW and playing back out of the analog outputs. First time I ever did that too, by the way, into the analog desk and the analog bus compression and stuff. And I really made a point of not touching any of the audio. They were just being played back 96K 24-bit exactly as they had been recorded. Which if you do that and you don't mess with it, it works pretty well. Like if you do that, literally that's all you're doing. You don't have to dither because you're you're putting out exactly what was taken in the first place. It's just like voop, voop, no processing, no changes, no alterations, no gain changes. And it's literally being done that way. That said, yeah. And then the other question is, what are the plugins in the top right? These are the ones that are going to be included in the Airwindows Beginner Mix Kit or the Airwindows Basic Get You Started Kit, which might also include a PDF file included in it to explain how all of these different things work. And they're chosen to be very simple. So I should be able to put together a PDF file of some kind, or draw a cartoon, I don't know, that outlines, maybe I should do a cartoon for it because it would make it more amusing and interesting to people. Outlines what each of these little things do, and they're as much as possible simple and basic, so I can explain them in like a few lines and have the how-to, have the instruction manual be very, very simple and not overwhelmingly complicated. Ben asked, do you still need to pan with LCR mixing? Well, L and R count as panning. They're just hard panning. Everything that I'm doing is literally with pans of some kind or other. Like, you don't need to replace a DAW pan if you're just making it be hard left and right. If you have the DAW pan in the middle, technically that's probably including a 3 dB gain. So I could see that being an argument for doing a purist gain style thing that was purist pan, given that the pan law does not mean middle position is both of the things at full volume. But if the stuff that you're recording is in stereo pairs and you hard pan them, then that negates the need for any complicated panning type thing. So desaturation plugin, that wasn't me. I've got stuff kind of like that, like the console system is literally a saturation and desaturation thing, which does it perfectly if it's the correct version of it. Like Purist Console, Console 5, as depending upon the input that you put in, are perfect desaturators. Let's talk about separating sound with panning. All the coffee. So when we talk about separating sound with panning, we get into the whole reason why I tend to hulk out and get really cranky about products like Soothe and so on, because there seems to be this implicit assumption that you take all of your sounds and then you make them all have glorious treble and glorious mid-range and glorious bass, and they should sound great soloed, and that is so far from the truth it isn't even funny. It is wildly not what you want, and it seems like everybody is viewing things in this way now. So you wind up being like, well, let's pan everything in little places to desperately try to separate all these things that are coming across at full bandwidth. And that is super inappropriate for making mixes that really communicate and are effective. Instead, what you end up with is, like, let's talk frequencies. In frequencies, you can separate stuff out by sort of making a composite. You're having, like, here's your bass, you haven't brightened up or clarified the bass, so it's all sitting really in the lows, and then your kick drum is a heavy whamp or something like that, and then your cymbals were already bright, so those are bright, and then you've got a guitar which is a small speaker, so it's not coming across with a lot of bass, and they naturally fit together into a composite whole. Well, it's not only a matter of frequencies, although you can effectively make mixes work by, like, with the one that I did, for instance, where I'm making the composite sound of the band sound big and heavy because the bass guitar has a bottom octave on it, which is actually almost lower than the kicks, although, because, again, with the composite sound of things, drum kit, I do not have a individual bass drum that is close mic'd and sculpted to form. What I have is, side, slightly front, slightly distant mics, and those are the overall sound of the kit. And then I have the one mic behind my chair, like my body is slightly sheltering this mic from the snare drum. It's kind of slightly masking it from the snare drum, which is handy. And that is pointed straight at the kick drum, but it's an SM57 with no EQ on it. That's not getting any bass. But when I lay into the kick drum hard enough, everything shakes and shudders and rumbles, and the platform that it's on thunders and rumbles, and the overall sound still has that SM57 mid-range quality with the presence peak and everything. And it's helping some of the attack come through, but then the low end is just a chaos of rumbly toms and so on. And the end result, and it's also the kick is tuned down really very low, and it's loose, but it's not like there's no pillow in it or anything. But I have like stuff taped to it and so on, and it's tuned so that there's a side of it that's loosened to the point where it wrinkles, and so it simply doesn't resonate very long. These are not drums that go boom, not at all. And the conjunction of all those things means that the composite sound makes something that sounds and feels like a kick drum being hit really, really, really hard, because it is. I have a video on that as well, a video on speed kingizing Axis longboards. Axis is a fancy kind of drum pedal that I've got, and Speed King is a classic drum pedal that squeaks and is unreliable, and I've actually broken one with my foot when I was a teenager. I had a Speed King pedal and I was very happy with it until I literally shattered the metal, the part that holds the beater, because I have a heavy damn foot. All of these things need to resonate with what they are. Like, I have a mix where the guitars are like a single 12-inch speaker, and they have a penetrating mid-rangey quality, and my drums have the correct sound, but they sound very classic rock because I'm not distorting or compressing or multi-miking them at all. Instead, it's kind of just the room sound, but I've controlled what the room is. It's not just an ordinary room, but it's a room with a large divider and it made out of doors. And and there's a platform that the drums are on. Everything about it makes it act a little bit different. But the end result, since it's not compressed other than the bus compressor, you wind up having this intense spike, because the purpose of the drums is to have the intense dynamic spikes as long as they still feel correctly like drums rather than sounding like electronic ticks or something like that. So it's getting all this other stuff to come together, like the drums are very resonant, I don't have them all damped down and stuff. So that when I hit the drum, what I get out of the recording is like essence of spike, essence of transient hit, and it's bringing that to the mix so that other elements of the mix don't have to do that part. Kind of like parts of the mix might be bassy and parts of the mix might be trebly. It's this whole thing of if everything, if you have everything panned together and it turns into a mush, then separating out the pan isn't going to help. If you have everything EQ'd the same, or everything has ideal bass, treble, and mid-range and so on, when soloed, you'll combine those things together and it'll be a complete garbage fire because things are not representing their purposes. You want to have, like, if you've got, distant horns, those are going to want to be really, really resonant to cut through a mix properly and represent what they're there to do. You're not necessarily going to want heavy bassy lows or indeed highs on your distant horn sound, because those would distract from what you're trying to make them do in the mix. Much like I could easily have thrown a couple of plugins on and distorted or compressed, or both, the drums in this particular mix that I'm doing. But what makes it difficult to do, it's designed to be hard to do a digital version of, because that's the challenge I'm setting myself. I'm going to try to replicate what I did in this analog mix, but the analog mix is taking every single element and trying to put forth the essence of what that thing is supposed to do, like loud, snarly, intense, overbearing guitars, or a Rickenbacker bass with a lot of skronk and a lot of personality and character, or drums that absolutely kick or slam or like really throw your head back, if you've got it turned up loud enough for them to do that, because otherwise you can't. It doesn't actually work that way. And I got all of that stuff happening in an analog mix, and my job is not to do what the digital mix would do, throw all that away, make everything be equalized the same, make everything be compressed until it's all your gray paste of sounding very modern rockish. People already do that. I want to put together a beginner mix kit that offers the possibility, or even leads you in the direction of having things speak out as themselves. And this is why I've done things like put focus in there. Like, I wouldn't necessarily focus I could have just had Baxandall. The reason focus is in there is because if you've got some kind of element and you've like recorded it with some dull dynamic mic or something like that, or it's a condenser mic, so there's this grating highs and everything, and what you want to be a very upfront present lead vocal, for instance, is just a sheen of brightness and sparkle, and there's no body to it, you can use focus to fix that as well. But it's specifically for the purpose of taking stuff that needs to step forwards and have that personality. And that's stuff that I'm getting out of some of the things on the analog desk because it's running through all those transformers and everything. So there's a certain like consolidating effect. I'm really getting the most out of having like all the individual things. And this is not unprecedented. Like I've got a documentary on my video shelf over there where, you know, DVD person, I've got DVDs. I've got a documentary on Sound City, a DVD documentary of that. And one of the things that was going on there is that when they were doing those hit records in Sound City, something that often happened was they'd put up a mic and they would record without any EQ or anything right into the board and to tape, and then play it back off of the tape. And because it was this elaborate, expensive Neve desk that was a glorious, glorious thing, and they had good monitoring and stuff, they had a situation where if they did that, they'd record it, they'd play it back, and it would sound fantastic right out of the gate. Because nothing was being lost from the situation. You can do that in digital, and that's what I tried to do with this analog mix. And then the challenge becomes doing the digital mix with the plugins, and rather than have it be your typical DAW mix of like you can balance everything, but it's not going to gel very well at all, getting all of the way that the analog stuff just comes together, but retaining like with like the choice of purest gain and stuff, using things like that where I can still have the sonority of things like those guitars coming through even though it's a digital mix. I'm really, really, really going to try to get it the same. Not just like, here's my new invention, this is my new vision of the mix, and this is how I would do it better. It's like, I want to try to replicate exactly what I had on the analog mix to show that I can with this particular set of plugins and with these choices. And in some ways it makes it easier because it's like I didn't equalize anything. Everything is just coming through as what it is, and it's arrangement and miking and recording that gave me the results that I had. So it's more a question of can I get the DAW parts of it, the digital audio workstation parts of it, to work where I'm getting the same effect as this pile of expensive analog gear and stuff. I mean, it's a pile of expensive analog gear, but if I can actually replicate it in the box, that's actually a striking thought. It's like, shit, if I could do this in the box, all I would need is like 3 inputs into a converter and be good to go. And have really good monitoring, be able to play back nicely and stuff. But yeah, these are the questions. So let me glance at some of our other things. Like it says, you don't really have a choice, you'll need the bandwidth they give you. That's fair. You still need a pan plug in into the console system for that stuff, so it's before the console channel. No, not necessarily. I think the way it's going to work is that if you're doing stuff in console and the pan law is 3 dB down, the stuff in the center of your mix will be very, very subtly more distorted. And remember, this is with a completely soft clip style curvature thing where you're not really going to hear it as such. The edges of your mix should be a little more expanded than the center based on the way that that works. And then recording stuff in left to right pairs ought to sum exactly perfectly. So that ain't necessarily a bad thing. I did a plugin wider specifically for letting you do that. So theoretically, you might want to have the middle of your mix be somewhat more accentuated, but what's being done is not so striking as that. MChan monitoring a sim clipper. What context is that from? Probably the answer to somebody's question. Oh, no, it's what that was when I was like, what plugin am I going to add? And it was MV. So Bricasti M7 left, right, and mid-side waves online as long as you've got a convolution reverb. Oh, fair enough. I mean, I make convolution reverb impulses too, so there's that. And including, I've synthesized ones where you can do, because you can synthesize convolution reverb impulses by just generating variations of noise and having it be functional. In essentially, if you can synthesize noise or generate that in any way through a process where it starts off with a transient bang and then fades off like as if you were shooting a gunshot in a live room. If you can make that happen and have it sound like it's fading away into the distance, then so will your reverb. Like, convolution reverbs are not the things where you have to go and get magic impulses from places. You can make those things with synthesis. And it's a fascinating thing to try to do. Can I make a plugin that sounds like a tube analog mixer? Well, the purpose of the upcoming project of the mix kit, the beginner kit for people to learn how to do stuff, and also for people to be able to get into an Airwindows mixing system without getting buried in all the plugins, which is a very important goal. Hopefully that's going to be a real game changer. I have hopes that it'll be like a viral type of thing where it'll catch on and people will be talking about it because they don't actually have to be digging through the entire piles of everything. It's become so daunting that this really needed to happen for a long time. As far as tube, it depends upon whether that's what you feel you need. Like, I'm getting some pretty good results out of a transistor-based one that happens to have a lot of transformers and things in it. And specifically, tube by itself isn't automatically what you want, but you might be able to get there by doing this particular thing, but using a little more of focus, using interstage, and constructing things to where that mid-range sonority is going to come out a little more. Like, focus might get you there. Focus might get you the tubey kind of quality that you wanted. What you would do is say, put it on your mix bus, or put it, here's a good idea. I've never thought of this, and I think it would work. Take focus and put it in between the console channels and Purist console bus. Like, put it first on your bus and then be very careful as to what you do with it. What you will be doing is as follows. You will be using focus, setting the Q, the resonance of it, to be very, very wide, and slightly nudging up the distortion until it sounds like what you want, because in doing that, you'll be taking the Airwindows console system, which is saturate and then desaturate to match, and enhancing the mid-rangey stuff that tube things sound like, and pushing the gain of it in a way that is a saturation that is already being decompensated by another saturation, so that your mid-range will be a little bit louder and a little bit more expanded at the same time. It should work. That's exciting. If I had a pen, I would write that down. I'll have to remember it, won't I? So there's your problem. If you want the thing to sound like a tube analog mixer, like those old Reds, those old Beatles things and stuff, that would probably get you there. You'd use focus, very wide Q, and use that to pump up the mid-range in between console. Not outside of it, inside of it, so that the gain boost that you're applying is going to be further accentuated by purest console buzz. I really think that would work. I really think that would work. Very cool. Very cool. So that's a definite plus. That's such a plus that I should make some comment about it. I'm trying to find if I've got it written down, and I don't even have it written down on my list. Huh. Okay. I'm super going to have to remember that. Thankfully, it's 12:31, and I'm only going to 12:37, so I should be able to remember that and write it down immediately once I get off camera. I got a few questions going on towards the end here, and we can also close that window for now. So are you still going to list the different plugins with explanations of the function they fulfill? With this new mix kit, I'm going to be able to do that. It's picked in such a way that it'll be easy to do, and it's, I think, a fundamental thing. It's much harder to do that with, like, if I do that with all 200 plus plugins, then the list is so long that it's impossible to get through. So doing it with this much smaller subset is going to be more appropriate. Link is offline. I'm glad that you like firework impulses. One problem with the firework impulse is that the initial sound is miles away and the decay is miles away. So they're all super dark. They shouldn't really be that dark, but they are. Trying stereo effects and wider and making string sections not disappear in mono. You got to reference stuff with mono. That's one of the reasons why I have monitoring. I'm pretty sure monitoring has a mono option. And the challenge with that kind of stuff is that your extreme stereo wideness stuff is generally based out of side content. But unless you have your sound being localized, either centered or strikingly on one side or the other, you're going to have problems with having it be hyper present in stereo and then still present in mono. There's no way around that. The more intensely stereoified a thing is, the more it's going to disappear in mono. What you could do is have it be intensely stereoified on one side only, maybe. Like it'll be very much localized, but it'll sound like beyond the, well, actually no, anything beyond the speakers is also going to vanish in mono. So there's the challenge. Like if you really want it to be super present, have it not be that stereo wide in the first place. But yeah, there's the thing. Oh, so Matt Lord's talking about Apple's adverb. Huh. I've not actually been that happy with Apple's verbs, to some extent with the exception of Space Designer, because that's a whole separate thing. But I've not been that thrilled with it simply because it's the type of algorithmic reverb where it can make beautiful textures on something like your high octaves on a piano. But I shoot for a reverb that sounds really far away. And the Apple stuff, even their fancier stuff, although it has good textures, and this is even true to some extent for things like Valhalla. I'm a big Valhalla fan. I think he's a great guy. I think the verbs that he makes sound phenomenal. He's got a bunch of different ones. But I don't always think that they sound far away. I think they sound like texture blocks. And that's useful too. And that's what you'd be getting with like the adverb or whatever. It's a particular kind of texture block. but that doesn't mean that it sounds like there's audio hundreds or thousands of feet off. So, different purposes for things. You might have a sound where you want to have a shimmery, ethereal, spacious effect that sounds up front and doesn't sound like it's really far away, because you don't really get high frequency shimmery in the super far off distance. You don't really get both of those things. It's going to be one or the other. So that is, it's a separate option. And I did make a bright ambience plugin, which is a ugly version of even more of that. See, I will never put oversampling option in my plugins, because I think you should be running at like 96K or whatever if you're doing that. That said, there are things where I intend to use I have in mind an idea for a distortion approach that it could be like the distortion combiner that I have not yet made, that gives you a bunch of different options on that. And it strikes me that if you're doing like 96K or 192K or whatever, there are ways to throw in a little quick averaging so that your input and output are somewhat degrungified as far as aliasing and stuff is concerned, given that the audio that your distortion thing is using needs to stay under 20K. Like at CD rate, it would not be engaged. At 88 or 96K, you'd have a single stage of averaging on both the input and the output to further clean up aliasing performance with the otherwise not oversampled thing. And then on 192K, maybe you'd have two stages on input and two stages on the output of the simple averaging thing, specifically for the purpose of just making it roll right out as you go up that high. And as near as I can tell, that would actually work, and it's fairly easy, and it's pretty easy and computationally cheap to do. Kevin, I am not moving to Reaper as my main DAW. In doing this new mix, I needed to go back to Logic to know what the hell I was doing. And I'm not really that worried about that anymore, because it's like I made a good solid try of that and it didn't really click with me. And I also keep running across like the Spitfire audio guy with his piano book and stuff. He's constantly using Logic for everything. People are constantly using Logic for like arranging and film scoring and stuff. A lot of the people that are doing fancy sampling stuff and inventing new things in those lines, those are likely to be people using Logic. Sometimes they're using Logic and then trying to mix in Pro Tools because they like the one thing and then the other. And although I don't work in sampling, all of my familiarity going back years and years and years is in Logic. And especially, and I'm very pleased with Apple for offering this 90-day free trial for people in the middle of the coronavirus thing. It's like, hey, try Final Cut and Logic and stuff for free for 90 days rather than the usual 30. It's like, yeah, it's a ploy. It's a ploy. But all the same, they're doing it, and that means people, at least on Macs, can try that, and so I will supply the plugins to let people learn how to do their thing if they're trying that for the first time, and that'll be kind of cool too. And like finally, have I considered doing a multi-rack? No, I'm not able to do that because that would involve hosting other plugins or making a bunch of ones that are still just only a list of sliders, but a huge conglomeration of sliders taking over the world. And although a huge conglomeration of sliders taking over the world is almost like very much on brand for me, but no, there will not be a multi-rack There will not be a Slade or Sound Toys style load this one plugin and then have all your other plugins in that. Like other people do that better than me. I would turn to Blue Cat and like patchwork and stuff if that's the kind of thing that you like doing, because Blue Cat's real good at that and even offers like GUIs and things with it. So yeah, it is now 12:40 and I got another thing to do at 1, so I'm going to have a little time to decompress. Probably not make another cup of coffee. I'll make another herbal tea or something and go about my day. And having done that, then I can spend the rest of the day working on this digital mix that I've been telling you about, because I need to do that. And with a bit of luck, I can get this out before waiting for another week. I'd like to get this moving as fast as I can, so I'm going to see what I can do with that. And yeah, I'm glad it was a fun Q&A. Again, sometimes I get snippy with folks, and that's fine. It's not maliciously meant. You know, I kind of stand up for myself sometimes. Yeah, do listeners only track. Show me it. So with that, I will say, talk to you guys later. I will say goodbye to the chat for now. I will indeed be staying safe. I've been spoke to my brother in email again recently, and we're still somewhat at cross purposes in that he still thinks all of this is a load of bullshit or something. And I'm like, what can I do? What can I do with this guy? Nothing, really. And no, you may not come over. But yeah, no, we're staying safe. We're staying healthy. Those of us who are insane and don't believe in any of all of this, I just wish them well. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.